Welcome to Congregational Death Community Life. This is a three-part series on institutional death, and that death being the pathway toward new life, toward the common good. I'm going to say a little bit about my co-host, Rick Mixon, in just a moment. But this series, which will continue on May 11th and May 18th, is brought to you by Sympara. We're a nonprofit organization engaged in sacred civic placemaking. We're a multi-faith community with a public mission to repurpose religious assets for the common good. And education is an important part of our work. So we're Rick and I are delighted that you've set aside the time today to have this important conversation. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. This will be a kind of fishbowl experience where you get to listen in to the conversation that Rick and I are having. And then we're going to invite you to join the conversation by asking questions in the chat. If we follow our time outline here, we'll have about 20 minutes for conversation with you to field your questions. Rick, we've known each other. I'm adding up the years now. I think this will be the 30th year because we met in 1991. That's a long friendship. We met at Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church in Oakland, California, where Rick was a member and had been engaged in your student ministry, field ministry, right? Going way back to the early 70s.
In the late 60s, actually.
Late 60s, okay, all right. So Rick is a longtime friend, counselor, teacher, someone that I deeply admire. And so I'm grateful that we get to have this conversation today. Rick is currently the interim pastor of Fairview Community Church in Costa Mesa, California. He previously led First Baptist Church of Palo Alto through a multi-year discernment process and an embrace of death. That congregation ultimately closed, and we will be talking about that experience during these sessions. Rick is a visiting professor of pastoral care at the Berkeley School of Theology, formerly the American Baptist Seminary of the West, which is both of our alma maters. For more than 4 decades, gosh, Rick, he has counseled individuals facing death. And he's also preached the good news that death is not the last word. I think that's something that Rick would certainly underscore. I was thinking about how we should start, Rick, today, and it occurred to me that any number of doorways, we could step through any number of doorways to start this conversation. We could start with the estimates of thousands of congregations closing across North America annually. Those estimates vary widely, anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 congregations. This was pre-COVID. We could talk about the possibility that many more will close in the coming months. We've also seen estimates there that as many as 20% of congregations in the U.S. could close within the next 15 to 18 months. And if that holds true, that might be as many as 60,000 congregations. We also know that the reality that thousands of more congregations struggle. As we were coming onto the call just now, we heard a story of a church in Vermont that's facing some real challenges. So I'm assuming most of the people on this call know these stories, are aware of these realities, if not engaged directly with them. But I want to step through a different doorway to start today. Yesterday, I saw a tweet from a pastor who is also a teacher and a coach of other pastors, particularly new church planters. And his tweet was this. He wrote, "I've had 28 pastor friends resign this year. Almost all of them are transitioning to a new vocation." And then he asked, "What is occurring?" And he just kind of just dropped that question out on his feed. At last count, about a half hour ago, there were 662 comments, lots of reshares or retweets. In the comments, as you scroll through those, you encounter sadness, frustration, anger, and lots of personal stories. People saying, "I'm among those folks that have left the clergy ministry this year." I was struck by one woman's reply. Her husband is pastor of a Wisconsin church, and she said, she wrote in her comment, "It's been a tough year," and she knows tough years. I did a little research and discovered that in 2015, their church building burned to the ground, a total loss. And that building was built in 1868 and was formerly the Congregational church. Her church today is non-denominational. So the building itself, even before it had burned down, had already encountered transition and a kind of death. Rick and I, over these next 3 sessions, will be talking about death equivalents. We can talk about death as physical death, but there are other kinds of death that we experience. This past year, however, has been particularly tough for this woman and her husband. And she wrote, "My husband just told someone we die a little more every Sunday. We die a little more every Sunday." That just struck me, and it just underscored the profundity, the gravity of what congregations are facing now. Rick, you led a church in Palo Alto through its death in a time of pandemic. We're going to talk about that experience, as I said, later. Now you're guiding another church as an interim pastor through a time of transition when it seems that the whole world is going through transition. So my first question for you is, why have this conversation when death is so obvious, so ubiquitous? It's all around us.
Well, Daniel, we were just talking. The answer's in the question itself. It's ubiquitous. It's all around us. I mean, it's the air we breathe, or the water in which we swim, and so the challenge is really how do we address the reality that's facing us? How do we understand death? How do we deal with death? How do we if we believe that God is all about life, how do we ensure the presence of God in the midst of ubiquitous death? So I think that's that may be the great work is how do we learn to live with this reality in which we swim? I mean, the pandemic certainly has put that, 500,000 or more deaths going on, 600,000 deaths in this country alone, 3 million worldwide. The threat of death in terms of the numbers of people infected. The threat to democracy. Death surrounds us in so many ways. So
yes,
how do we live?
Death. I'm thinking about death due to gun violence. Every day it seems there's a new story. death at the hands of police by uh, being experienced by our Black brothers and sisters. So yes, it is indeed all around us. We're going to be talking in these coming sessions about uh, the end of Christendom, to use Diana Butler Bass's language, or the disestablishment of the church, to use Douglas John Hall's phrase. You and I've talked, Rick, and have shared some thoughts on how it does feel like something's coming to an end in terms of our religious experience. Say a little bit about what that means for you.
Well, I was thinking as you were sharing those that data from your colleague in the introduction. I'm 74 years old. I'm doing an interim. Maybe I have one more interim in me. I I'm in some ways set, at least professionally. But one of the things that's really hit me hard in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years serving in the church, that business about we die a little bit every day is so true. And I think in terms of my pastoral experience, those times when I come up against the reality that I and maybe a lot of people doing pastoral work today were trained for the church of the 1950s.
Mm.
And that church, the boom of the church post-war, is now rapidly disappearing. And we've spent a lot of time and energy and money trying to hang on to that,
Mm-hmm.
not recognizing that maybe the death of that phenomenon could be a good thing
Mm-hmm.
if we were to turn, if we were to repent, to turn and address it in some other way than it's like, oh, how do I save what has been sacred?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And am I thinking, I've sort of given myself permission to let go of that. To
Mm-hmm.
say, that may be what I love and what I'm trained to do, but I can find some places to do it long enough to get to retirement. But I don't. That's not true for many people who are trying to do pastoral leadership.
That's right. That's
That's
right.
that ubiquity of death, I think,
Mm-hmm.
in the institutional church.
Uh, next week, in next week's session, we're going to talk about the peril and promise of death. And our question next week will be, why do we deny death? So we're gonna consider some psychological, cultural, and theological responses to death. I think significant in our reflection will be the work of Ernest Becker, his pioneering book, The Denial of Death. The third session, we will talk about the practice of death, and our question there is, how do we go through death as community? And in that session, we're going to reflect together on lamentation, liminal space, discernment of new life. We'll talk in detail about your experience in Palo Alto and what it meant for that church to go through lamentation and liminal space to that discernment of new life on the other side of closing. But this week we wanted to root this conversation in personal experience, the personal and communal work of death. And our question today is, how does death shape us? So we want to take a few minutes to talk about early experiences of death in our families, and in the context of congregations. Both Rick and I are both preacher's kids, and so in some ways, the family and the church are kind of woven together. from the cradle. So I wonder, Rick, as you think about um, uh, your early experience of death, uh, how did that shape your view of congregational death?
Yeah, I give you just a little bit of background. I met death at a relatively early age when the choir director at our church in Boise, Idaho, where I sort of grew up, uh, died very suddenly. A young man with four young children, and I remember when I was probably middle school going to his funeral. The First Baptist Church of Boise was packed with people, you know. Then my own father died who was my pastor, the voice of God for me, died when I was 17, and in spite of the church on their knees praying that he would be uh, spared. And then for several summers afterwards, it seems like every July there was a significant death in my life. A dear high school friend, my piano teacher. So that's been a regular visitor in my life, just periodically. And so, in one sense, I've had to accommodate it, had to learn somehow to live with it, or you just get stuck in what we're referring to as those death equivalents, you know, stagnation or depression or overwhelming anxiety, trauma, etc. Um, so of course, because it informs all of my life, it informs my view of congregational death, and maybe, hopefully, it's helped me to be a little bit more prepared, a little bit more willing to accommodate the reality that congregations I serve, congregations I love, congregations I have admired, are struggling and dying all around us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think for myself, I think of two moments that were formative. The first was that an older brother died 28 years ago, was hit by a drunk driver. And I remember gathering in our family's home, the parsonage. My dad was a preacher at a little Baptist church, and he had he had toiled at that church at that point when my brother died for I think about 17 years or so, and and it was just such hard work, and all consuming for him. He had gone through seminary at a time when the church growth movement was taking off in the 1970s. So lots of literature in his tradition and other traditions about growing healthy churches, and um, but the numbers were not there in our little church on the corner. And um, I think my dad felt like a failure. Uh, uh, and my brother's death suddenly kind of um, drove that home for him. That's how he experienced it. And I was observing this. Um, we didn't have any money to be able to fly to from California, where we lived, to Houston, where my brother died. Um, and then it was a church family that stepped up and said, "We'll take care of those expenses for the entire family." Um, so it was kind of for me in that moment of um, uh, this mixture of seeing the toll that the congregation took on my father, the toll on his how it disappointed his aspirations, um, how he took on such a heroic uh, stance in relationship to the church. We're going to talk in a future session about that heroic posture in denying death. Ernest Becker spends a great deal of time talking about heroism in the face of death, and he doesn't mean that in a positive way. But that was my dad's story. But then also seeing the generosity of the church in the midst of death, standing with us in death. Fast forward to 10 years ago, my dad died suddenly of a massive stroke. He was packing up my mom in his home. They were preparing to move to a new church, where he was so excited to have the opportunity to serve late in his career. He wasn't sure if any church would hire him at his age. And then as he packed up the moving truck, he slumped during a break, slumped in his chair and never regained consciousness. We had the service for my dad in that church where he was to start in 2 weeks, which was pretty wild. And that church, even though my father hadn't started, showed us such hospitality, made room for death in the life of their congregation as they welcomed our family, as they welcomed people that my dad had served over the years. So that was particularly impactful to see again that kind of combination of my dad struggling with his notion of what it meant for the church to flourish, wanting that opportunity to be part of a church that was flourishing, coming up short on those aspirations, and then a church stepping up to make room for death. What do you notice in our stories, Rick, of early this kind of, as you put it, an early acquaintance with death?
Well, I mean, that last piece you shared about, the community, the gathered community, reaching for life in whatever way it can in the midst of death, faced with the inevitability of death and not being able to make that go away, at least can do something like, assisting your family to get to the funeral. I know when my dad died, I was on a trip. I was in the midst of a trip. I'd won this speech and essay contest to go to the United Nations between my junior, senior years in high school. And I was somewhere I was in Rockford, Illinois when he died. And, people paid for me to fly home. And after the funeral, people paid for me to fly back to New York and join the tour for the rest of the tour.
Wow.
So there's, death doesn't have to abrogate life, but it needs to be looked at realistically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One thing I was thinking about, Daniel, I hadn't thought about this example, but you really can't talk about death. Maybe this is one of the great death equivalents, but you can't talk about death without talking about loss and the sense of loss. And so in whatever ways the sense of loss touches on our lives, I know Linda and others who've done interim work in the interim training, they talk to us about how whatever goes on, whenever there's change, there's always loss. Mm-hmm. And that loss impinges on, that sense of death, that sense of being without. I guess we can come back and talk more about that. But what I was thinking of particularly was I was involved in a relationship with another man for 23 years. And, he had a kind of a golden existence. He never had to really face a deep dive into death until he was close to middle age,
Mhm.
when his sister suddenly died, just shockingly. And it threw him so much that, well, our relationship was one of the casualties of that experience. He as he struggled to deal with loss for the first time in his life, he, for whatever reasons, couldn't sustain the relationship that we had, sadly. But so, I mean, it's just another way that death impinges on our lives in terms of experiences of loss.
What 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 kind of theology were you hearing articulated about death as you experienced it at an early age?
Well, I know, in the early days it was, well, this is God's will, and they've gone to a better place, and we will join them all in the sweet by and by, and
Right,
and
right.
um, I mean, that was the dominant theology by far.
Hmm.
And um, I was thinking where you were going, for a number of years. Because I came, another loss in my life, because I came out publicly in 1973. It was 23, 24 years before I was actually ordained, even though I finished seminary in 1973. So there was that loss for me, as a result of coming out. And um, I did a number of years. I was a marriage and family therapist for a number of years and did AIDS work in the
Yeah.
midst of the AIDS epidemic. And oh my gosh, the profound sense of loss and death people face with being 45, 50 years old and having lost their entire company of friends that they
Mhm.
had, friendships that they had built up over the years. How do you ever, uh, that's something you can't compensate for in
Yeah,
some
yeah.
if you start over at 50 what you started at 20, it it's a different world. So,
I appreciate you mentioning that because it reminds me that when I first met you in 1991, when my wife and our oldest daughter first visited Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church in Oakland, you gave the pastoral prayer that Sunday, and uh, uh, to the best of my recollection, and prayed for people who were uh, dying of AIDS, their lovers and friends who were grieving, and that was the first time that I had heard um, such compassion from a pulpit, rather than condemnation, coming out of a conservative evangelical tradition. Um, but the fact that it happened in the church, I guess, is the point that we're getting here to. That church in particular um, had a practice of death. We'll probably talk more about that church in our third session. But another story that goes to that: when my brother died, I remember a man approaching me after the service when I had an opportunity to speak. I think this was probably a couple months after my brother's death, and this man, who must have been in his late 70s, met me midway down the aisle and said two things. One, his brother also had died at an early age. And then number two, he said, and I've never gotten over it. And what I remember is that that was the most gracious thing that anybody could say to me. because I did not want to get over my brother's death. I didn't want anything to do with that kind of theology that you mentioned a moment ago. It was it was a moment full of grace when he said, "I never got over it," and it happened. I mean, pretty much in the center of that church.
Yeah.
So appropriate for Lakeshore.
Yeah, and Daniel, I believe that as somebody who practiced psychology and counseling for a number of years, I believe that the experiences that we have become a part of our makeup, and we cannot make them go away.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whether we acknowledge our experiences or not, they are there. They are part of our makeup. And as a counselor, as a pastor, it seems to me to offer that gracious invitation to acknowledge the things that make us who we are, without having to dwell on those things in a way that's obsessive or limiting, or Carrie During in her book on pastoral care, are life denying. You know,
Mm-hmm.
to not let those realities, and they are realities. I mean, the deaths in my life will always be a part of who I am,
Mm-hmm.
and always will shape who I am. But do I let those experiences be life denying, or do I give those experiences space and grace to be life affirming? Do I
Mm-hmm.
look to ways to say, you know, what did I learn? What did I benefit? What was and continues to be the meaning of those experiences, those relationships, that can serve life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think Lakeshore here again is instructive in the way in which um, death was regarded, deaths were remembered, the saints were remembered, that great cloud of witnesses that gathered, that circled around us um, all the time. And it was also the path to new life, because of the memory uh, of of uh, of those folks. We were able to turn to new possibilities. Um, we could probably name any number of folks who did that for us. I think of Daisy Funderburk, who was the
Mm-hmm.
director of Christian education at the church for many years, um, um, and her death for me being catalytic in terms of a posture that I wanted to take toward life. Uh, uh,
Yeah.
Last thing I'll say about Lakeshore, we could talk on and on about Lakeshore, but
We,
but
we,
the ministry of Jim Hopkins, who's been the senior pastor there for
32 years.
32 years now. Um, you know, when we talk about the heroic framework uh, uh, next week, we'll also talk about alternative approaches. And Jim's is certainly the counter alternative. If some people judge their ministry by the metrics of a dominant culture in terms of success, um, Jim judges it in a very different way. He once told me that he knew that he would have finished his ministry at Lakeshore and finished well when he buried a particular couple. Um, and that's just wow. I mean, to define your ministry in that way, not the obsessing over death that you were talking about, but
Yeah.
the reminder of such good lives that have been lived, that have been the catalyst for his ministry and uh, for the for the forward uh, looking and remembering congregation that is Lakeshore.
Well, and let's talk for just a second about memory, about how we hold in our memory those things, those experiences, and those our emotions and thoughts that arise around them. Um, whenever I do memorial services, I always start by saying we have gathered to do two things: to grieve and to remember.
Mm,
And you're welcome to share tears, and you're welcome to share laughter, um, and whatever else you're feeling.
mhm,
So that how memory and how we hold it becomes crucial. One other experience I had was for 4.5 years I served as sort of the chaplain at a low income senior housing unit, and the place was right next to a great big church, but the folks who lived in that place were not terribly altogether. A lot of them were not churchy people, and they really, when people died in that community, they really didn't want to trek over to the church and have a service in the church. They wanted to gather in the community room, the dining room downstairs. And I learned a lot about just creating a little service. It had a religious frame to it, but the gist of it was just being able to gather and to remember and to share those memories.
mm, mm.
And that's life giving in the
Oh,
midst of
definitely, definitely.
crucial.
We want to open up this conversation now to you all, and um, we want you to use the chat to ask your questions. We've got about 20 minutes left here, and so we want you to share your questions or observations on what has been shared so far. And while people are uh, thinking about their questions or comments, and putting those into the chat, Rick, um, you made death a part of your PhD work. We're gonna go in. We're gonna talk about your study of Robert J. Lifton next week, I think. But maybe just very briefly, you can kind of tease that. Why was that so important for you to make the subject of your dissertation?
Well, Daniel, it wasn't what I had planned to do initially. I had a whole different project that people had really encouraged me to write on. This was a PhD in religion and psychology or personality.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I got around to my dissertation, I was in the midst. It was in the midst of the AIDS crisis, and I was doing that work as well as working on my PhD, and struggling with loss and suffering. And I just happened to look across my room at my bookshelf, and there was this purple covered book on my bookshelf that I'd bought on a remainders table that was titled "Suffering." Uh,
Mm,
and it was Dortezola's. It's a great work on suffering from
mm,
the Vietnam War, and and so I ended up writing on suffering. Suffering, pain, and death were really the themes,
mhm,
and Zola and talking about talking about the need for lamentation led me to Lifton and the whole notion of psychic numbing. So
mm, okay.
that
Okay.
was sort of the trajectory for that.
That's good. We're going to talk. We're definitely going to talk more about that in the
Yeah,
upcoming sessions.
right.
We have a question from Nancy Wilbanks. Can you talk about what the congregational death equivalents look like? Depression, stagnation are words you mentioned about people. What are the signs of death in an institution?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could open. You guys list them in the chat. I mean, you know what they are: declining membership, declining leadership, declining resources, declining buildings that we can't afford to maintain anymore, deferred maintenance, um, uh, uh, all of the things that impinge on people's lives now, from back in the day, back I mentioned the church of the 50s, back in that day, the church was the center of the community in lots and lots of places. It was the place where people gathered. It was the place where people did business. And that just ain't true anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the signs are all over the place. The death equivalents, Nancy, depression, stagnation, uh, anxiety, unprocessed trauma,
Mm-hmm.
boredom, all of those things and more.
I would add to that an inward turn, not inward
Yeah,
in terms of spirituality or the journey inward, but an inward turn in terms of the tribe that is getting smaller, focusing more and more on its own survival. This will be their bulwark against death. This will be how they collectively deny death. I've also observed the kinds of stories that get created out of that inward turn, out of a disconnection with the wider community. I served as the interim pastor of a church next to the University of Texas, and when that church was founded as a ministry to the university, um, it filled its pews with students, faculty, and staff. And then, like a lot of the university congregations, um, um, saw that the decline over the years. But then they I think, as a defensive mechanism, began to tell a story about themselves, that they were too progressive for the university, that the university's students, faculty, staff would not be interested in this small, declining, but progressive congregation. When the reality was that the people across the street, literally across the street, shared their values for justice, inclusion, equity, sustainability. But they had turned inward on themselves and cut themselves off from the wider community. So I think that's a significant sign of congregational death.
yeah. David Gregg mentions hopelessness and impotence as other death equivalents.
Yeah, yeah,
What
yeah.
you just said goes to Marcia's question here about how do we help people come face to face with the reality of death, because I think you're right. Oh, and you're so right, Marcia. It's a sacred memory. Don't you remember? Oh, it was so wonderful when such and such and such and such. When we packed the fellowship hall for the Easter brunch and we put out the linen and the silver and the china, and oh, it was so wonderful back in those days. But that ain't going to happen anymore. So how do you, and so the story, actually, Daniel, I think you should tell the story. I've hooked on to a story that Daniel told me about his experience in Austin, um, about inviting churches, and it's easier, I think. Linda can speak to this, but when you're in an interim situation, to come in and say, look, you guys can focus on who you were and how beautiful it was back in the day, and the sacred life and the sacred things that happened in this sanctuary, and you can sit here and stew in those memories until the undertaker comes, or the bulldozer comes, or whatever, or you can say, um, the, what people experienced here is a legacy on which we can build,
Mm.
um, or we might at least build. Can we consider what can we do creative? What can we do new? What can we do radically different to continue to be a community rooted in that reality.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
tell them the story of the window blinds in the office, Daniel. That I love to tell that story.
Oh, yeah. The pastoral study was across the street from the university, and when I came to the church, the blinds were closed, and I was told that they were never opened. And so one of the first things I did was raise those blinds. I wanted the light to come in. I also wanted to see this university. I wanted to see the street um, that we were alongside, and the traffic up and down that street of students and um, others. Um, One of the refrains I had in Austin was, "We've got to cross the street, folks. We've got to get reacquainted with this university." So that goes to your point, Rick, about kind of building on that legacy. That's where memory can be catalytic to
Yeah,
say, this is, as we look back into the history of the church, this is why we were founded. What does that mean for us today, given a very different context, um, given the disestablishment of the church? What does it mean for us to be in relationship with this community? I remember having coffee with a student once at the beginning of the school year, and then bringing her, a block down the street to show her the church. And there happened to be some church members out in front who were, uh, uh, as their kind of a traditional ritual of passing out water bottles and welcoming the students back to a new year. And I introduced this graduate student, and one of the longtime members said, "So, are you gonna join our team?" And I jumped in. I said, "No, we're going to join her team.
yes,
Whatever she's doing in the world, whatever she's set her mind to, whatever she's preparing for across the street, that's what we need to be about." So
yeah,
that was consistent with the legacy of the church,
yeah,
um, but it also did not deny death. That the reality of her coming to church and sitting in the pew, that wasn't going to happen. Um, but we could still be the church. We could still accompany her and her classmates and others in that community in a new way. Yeah.
yeah. Lisa's made a comment here, which I think gets to this point about, sometimes those good old days were not so good, and we tend to romanticize and embellish that past, and that certainly is a liability. But but um, learning to live beyond um, some spiritual direction talks about taking a long, loving look at reality,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that long, loving look should be able to accommodate both what was really not so good about the good old days, and also acknowledging what was good about them. So it doesn't become an either or prospect, because I think there is inevitably something good to be gleaned from the memory of the past. But
And,
that romanticization is the belief, the embedded belief, that church is supposed to be a certain way. It's supposed to look a certain way.
yeah.
And ideally, it includes a fabulous sermon, a magnificent organ, a big choir, ushers in sync. I don't know. That's a kind of romanticized ideal it's hard, especially for older people who were imbued with that tradition, to let go of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Marcia's made a comment in the chat that the difference is people used to literally come to church, and now undoubtedly the church needs to go to the community, and that's a huge switch for some folks.
I think the first memory verse I learned in Sunday school was, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. You
Mhm.
know,
Mm.
uh, as a preacher's kid, going to church was a big deal. It was a highlight of the week.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's a part of that romanticized, potentially romanticized reality that we need to let go of if we're really committed to the gospel being a living word in in the world in 2021.
Mhm. Mhm. The Marcia's put another comment here about COVID teaching our community that we don't need our building to be church, and it's making me think that this season of death, when religious communities have been gathering virtually, um, uh, has potentially opened us up to new understandings of what it means for the institution to die, and what it might look like for us to embrace that death in order to encounter life. Um, and part of what I've observed in conversations with congregations over the last few months is that increasingly they're 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 saying two things: that this digital connection here, it may not be everything that we would want in spiritual community, but it's not bad. I mean, it's pretty good. We can have a conversation of depth, meaning here. And then from this vantage point, looking back at their properties, the sanctuary, the buildings, and saying, maybe we don't need all of that in the way we thought we needed it. Maybe we don't need those structures the way we thought we really depended on them. So the pandemic is spurring on this kind of new awareness. And then I think also just the social context in terms of Black Lives Matter and uh, uh, the increasing sense that there's a call to religious communities um, to respond to the world, to engage the world. Um, so when they're turning back to their congregations and saying, maybe we don't need this the way we thought we needed it, the buildings, they're also saying maybe we could leverage this in some way to address the inequities in our neighborhood, our community, our city. Um, and that's a turning that goes right through death. It's not a denial of death. It is the embrace of death as pathway to new life.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking theologically for a moment. You know, we are as Christians, we're part. Those who are Christian, we're part of a tradition that has this enormous focus on death and resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And we've all heard and preached the word that, very often something has to die so that something can be born from it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that's part of how we address that business of romanticization and also of, you know, um, what wasn't so good about the good old days. Maybe something had to die so something could be born of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of comments here in our last few minutes. Nancy has asked, "Are there spiritual signs of death and resurrection beyond the numbers?" She writes, "I'm asking my congregation to imagine what church might look like post-pandemic." Um, uh, I think it goes to what I was just saying about recognizing that something significant has changed, a death equivalent, and then uh, moving beyond that to think about, okay, with what we have in terms of our assets, what we've experienced in terms of our community, how might this be um, be maximized or leveraged for the benefit of our wider community. David has noted that he agrees with my statement that maybe we don't need that the way we thought we did, but he's still asking how do we need it? What's being together in person good for, or even indispensable for? What are your thoughts on that, Rick?
Well, it strikes me, David, that well, at root, we're social animals. We need community, and that's again that's a part of our faith tradition, the centrality of community. Um,
Yeah.
so we believe in the gathered community. Now, do we need to gather in person? Yeah, I don't know. We're learning. This little church where I'm serving, we're committed to going forward. We're at least we're trying to be committed going forward to ensuring that we do hybrid in terms of our church gatherings, because we have people from Boston and Boise and Seattle and Chicago. One of your pastors, David, comes every Sunday from Chicago, even Uganda.
Wow.
And
Wow.
and some of those people really are contributing to the life of the community. So how we see or shape community, it may end up looking very different. But I believe we need community. I believe that we can't operate as I might teach this when I teach pastoral care. I try to teach pastors. We cannot operate as lone rangers. We need support. We need colleagues. We need
Mm-hmm.
people that we can share with. We need community in order to do the work of pastoring, however that work involves. I just want to say one quick response to Nancy Wilbank's question. Beyond numbers, the crucial questions that we're asking as a small congregation looking to the future is, do we have the people power? Do we have the energy? Do we have the leadership to be able to do something new?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a crucial juncture in terms of the question of congregational death.
Mm-hmm.
We can dream all we want to dream, but if we don't have the resources, money, energy, people, time, leadership, it ain't going to happen.
Unless
So
that energy
those
comes
are-
from other sources.
well, I mean,
Yeah.
but you got to have that energy from
Yeah.
some source in
Yeah.
order
Yeah.
for there to be continuity.
Yeah. I think we'll be taking up that matter. David's question is a good one, and so we might wrestle with that too in the next two sessions.
Yeah.
This series continues next Tuesday, May 11th, from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. We'll use the same Zoom link. The next session is entitled "The Peril and Promise of Death," and our question that we're going to dig into is, why do we deny death? A recording of this session will be posted to the event page in the next couple of days on the Sympara website. And we're grateful that all of you have taken the time today to be part of this, and we hope to see you next week.
Amen.
And to be continued. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.